Hey, so I wanted to show you guys how quickly and easily you could get started using the Microsoft Graph, creating applications using the Microsoft Graph within the SharePoint framework. So you can now create SharePoint applications, and even as of last week with the release of version 1.7 of the SharePoint framework, we can create applications for Microsoft Teams as well. So I thought I'd go through some examples here and get you guys started and show you just how easy it is to take advantage of the graph in the SharePoint framework. So what I'm going to be showing you is I'm going to show you how to get started with the graph in the SharePoint framework. I'm going to show you how to grant your application permissions from within your tenant. We're going to be doing a get in the Microsoft Graph in this video. I'm going to do a follow-up video after this one showing you how to do a post, but to get started we're just going to do a get. And then we're going to take our SharePoint framework solution and we're going to deploy it within SharePoint. And we're then going to take it and we're going to make it work within Microsoft Teams so we can deploy it as a Teams application and have it read information about your team. So there's going to be a lot of links that I went through to piece all of this information together. So look for the blog post on this video and I'll list all the links for where I found everything. So there's a lot of pieces here, but it's really straightforward and easy to do as long as you do it. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that you need to do is go and download the SharePoint Framework version 1.7 if you want to create a Teams application. The Microsoft Graph itself has been in the SharePoint Framework since 1.41, I believe. So if you don't have the latest version, that's fine. You can still get this to work. But we want to get this, for this example, we're going to be doing stuff for Teams and SharePoint. So that's the reason I'm using version 1.7. So let's go ahead and create our SharePoint Framework project. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make a directory and we'll call it Dummies Guide. And I'm going to execute yo Microsoft SharePoint, and I'm going to do the -- plus beta. This is needed as of right now. Today is November 11th, 2018. And you need to do the -- plus beta to make sure you get the scaffolding for the Teams functionality. Again, that's only needed for the Teams portion of it. It's not needed for the Microsoft Graph, and it's not needed for if you're just creating a SharePoint web part. But we want to do Teams stuff as well. So we're going to create this project. We'll call the solution Dummies Guide, SharePoint Online Only. We'll use the current folder. We do want to allow it to be deployed. We're creating a web part name. We'll call it Hello. How about Hello Dummy? And we're going to use no JavaScript framework. So now it's going to go through and it's going to create a project for us. And through the magic of editing, I will not make you guys sit through the few minutes that this takes. Okay, now that our project is created, let's launch Visual Studio Code and let's take a look at it. So what's new in version 1.7 of the framework is that we now have this Teams directory where we can look at some information that we have for Microsoft Teams, that these are the files we need to deploy the application to Teams. But we don't have to worry about these for any of the development we're doing. So don't even have to look at that right now. But what we do, we've got our file here, we've got our web part, and we have our main TypeScript file, and we want to use the Microsoft Graph now. So we need to actually import the Microsoft Graph. So to do that, we'll just come into our web part file here, and we'll tell it we want to import the Microsoft Graph client. We then need to expose the client through the MSGraphClient factory. So to do that, we're going to come into our render method and we're going to expose that. So to do that, we're just going to get the Microsoft Graph client, and now we can start actually just going here and executing graph code. It's as simple as that. So now we need to figure out which graph query do we want to execute that. And we'll need to also understand how does the response look like coming back from the graph, and what's all there. And so key to really understanding the graph and taking advantage of the graph is going to be the Graph Explorer. And this is something that you guys really need to become familiar with. It's a phenomenal tool, and it allows you to really explore all that the graph can do. And with the Graph Explorer, you can see that you have You can execute some sample queries, and it will actually spit back sample data. So doing the my profile query, you can see what the response looks like for that, and it's giving you sample data for what the query looks like. So if you want to get your mail, just use the get mail, and it'll show you what that response looks like and see what that data is coming back from the graph. And what you can even do is you can sign in with your Microsoft account, and it will give you actual results from your tenant, which is very cool when you're wanting to figure out what the data looks like from your tenant that you should be expecting. What you also see from the Graph Explorer is you can look for more samples, and it'll actually give you the ability to see all the different graph samples that are out there, and there's a ton. You can do, I mean, so many things. It would take forever to go through all these, but you can go into your mail, into your calendar, into your contacts. You can get into SharePoint, your OneDrive, security, groups, teams. There's some team stuff in beta. So it's just a really fantastic way to just dive into all the different pieces of Office 365 and get information, and also create information. So you could do things like create meetings and things like that. So we need to determine which query do we want to use for our example. And what I decided to use is the I want to get all the members for a group, so that we could create a web part, drop it onto a page in SharePoint, and it would give us all the members of that group that's for that modern site. But then we could also take that same program and drop it into a tab in Teams, and it would give us all the members for a team. So that's kind of what I figured we would do. And to do that, I've opened up another window for Graph Explorer here where I'm signed in with my account, and I want to do the query for get group members. And when you look at this, you can see that I need a group ID to execute to get group members. Don't know the ID off the top of my head, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a different graph query, and I want to see all the groups I belong to. So that's going to return a query for me here, and I can actually see all the different groups I belong to in my tenant. So what I can do is I can actually just pick one of these groups, and I can take the ID that's used in this to put it into the previous query. So here's a group called manufacturing, and here's the ID for that group. So now I can go back to the previous query of get group members, and instead of group ID up here, I'll put in the group ID for that manufacturing group, and now I can run the query. And you can see when I run that query the response that I get. So it is a JSON object, and you can see that it has the email address of the people in the group, the name of the people in the group, their preferred language. So this group only has 2 people in it. It's got me, and it's got Stephanie Donahue. So what I can do though is I can take the fact that I know the structure of this response, and I can take that I know how to execute it, and we can now put this functionality into our SharePoint Framework client web part. Okay, so again, to kind of recap, we added the import for the Graph client into our code. So we imported the MSGraphClient, and then we exposed it through the MSGraphClient factory. So we can now tell it which API we want to use. So I'm going to do a client.api, and then if we look at our code here in the graph, we wanted to do /groups, the ID of the group, and the /members to get us the members of this manufacturing group. So we'll paste that in there, and we're going to be doing a get on that. Okay, and with that get, we're going to get either an error or a response. So what I want to do for just testing purposes, I'm going to do a console.log error, and I want to do a console.log response. And that's all there is to it. This SharePoint Framework web part is now going to be calling into the Microsoft Graph to say, hey, get me all the members of this group. So I can save this project, and I can come over here and we can build it. So let's just do a gulp serve so that we can test it. So let's go into our workbench on our modern site. So I'll go to sites, I'll go to _layouts / workbench.aspx. So using our local workbench, I am going to open up our developer tool so we can see what's going on here. And I'm going to add the web part. And that web part was called Hello Dummy. So we've added that web part. It's executing that graph code, and we should see the console log for that. And if we look at that, we can see that we're actually getting an error. See, here's the error. It says the user or administrator has not consented to the use of the application. So what's happening here is that our web part is trying to use the graph, but it has not been granted access to do so from within the tenant. So what we have to do before we can actually execute the graph within our solution is we have to tell it what permissions does this call need, and then we actually have to deploy the application to SharePoint so that it will prompt our tenant for those permissions. So that's what we're going to do next. So what we need to do is determine what permissions does that call need. So if we come back to our Graph Explorer, again, this is going to be your best friend. We are doing the group members function. And next to that, we can click on the icon to get us more information about this query. One of those being permissions. So we can see to list the members of a group, we need the permissions user read basic all, user read all, directory read all, and directory access user. And this is shown from the least to most privileged. So, and you should always use the least privileged permissions that you need. Don't just give everybody access to everything. So we need to add the permission user read basic all to our solution. And to do that, we'll come back into our solution, and under our config folder, we have a package-solution.json file. And from within here, we will specify what permissions our solution needs. And that is specified by creating an entry for Web API permission requests. And here we specify that we're going to need access to the Microsoft Graph, and we want the scope of that, again, least privileged permission that this members needs, which is user read basic all. So now we can save our solution, and we need to actually package it up and deploy it so that we can force the system to prompt it for those permissions. So let's go through and build it. So I'm going to do a gulp bundle-ship. Now we will do a gulp package solution ship. Okay, that's done. So now we can come back into our tenant, and we can go to our app catalog, and we can upload the solution that we just created. And that was Dummies Guide. We'll go to the SharePoint folder, solution, and here's our package. We want to make it available to the organization, and you can see it's giving us this additional message. Please go to the Service Principals Permissions Management page to approve the pending permissions, because it needs Microsoft Graph user read basic all. So we're going to deploy this now. And now we need to go into our tenant admin. So let's go into admin, and we need to go to the SharePoint admin. So you either need to ask your SharePoint admin to do this, or you need SharePoint admin permissions to do this. But you do need to use the preview admin center, so you have to use a new admin center. And under that, you're going to have a link for API management. So let's click on API management, and you can see that it is, here are the permissions that are pending approval for our application. So we can go through here and we can select those, and we can approve them. And now those permissions are approved. If we refresh the page here, you can see that the user read all is approved. Sometimes you have to do these one at a time, so I'll just do them one at a time. And now these permissions are approved. And now it's important to note in your tenant, once you approve one client web part for a specific permission within the graph, all future client web parts that request that permission are automatically approved. We've got our web part deployed, so we can actually go to and create a page in our site if we want to, since it's actually deployed. So let's go into our site. Let's add a page. Let's open up our console too so we can see it. And we are going to add hello dummy. There's the web part added. And here's the call to the graph that we see. And we see that we're getting a console log of the actual response from the graph. And it is showing us those people within that group. So we've now successfully executed a graph query. We are getting that data. We can now do stuff with it within our SharePoint Framework web part. And if you've learned enough at this point where you want to take it and run with it, you can stop right now and you can go create some awesome solutions. But we want to take this a step further for this video. I want to do a little bit more than this. So what I want to do is I want to make it to where we can actually display some information. And I want to display the members of whatever group the modern site this client web part is added to. Right now we hard-coded that ID. If we go back and look at our code, so what I need to do is I need to figure out how do I get the ID for whichever group is associated with the site where this web part is deployed. And that is in the page context objects actually. So what we can do is let's go ahead and create a variable. We'll call it group ID. And it is going to be equal to this.context.site.group.id. This should be the ID for the group. And to test that out, let's go ahead and just print this out at the top of our web part. Right after the title, let's go ahead and print out our group ID, which would be group ID. And I also want to pass that into our call here. So instead of passing in the actual hard-coded ID, we'll pass in the value that it read from the page context. So let's save this. And now, since we have given this permission in our tenant for the permissions that this web part needs, we can go back to using our workbench. So I'm just going to do a gulp serve. So let's go into our workbench and we'll reload that. And you can see again, we are still getting the values for those users in the group. So now it's actually reading and it's giving us the ID and the title. So now we could theoretically add this app to any site and it would give us all the members for the group associated with that modern site. But let's make one more change to this code and let's make it actually display those names of the people in the group in the web part so we can see it actually display that information. So to do that, I'm going to take advantage of some information we already have here in the render method. I'm going to use this subtitle and I am going to create an unordered list for this, where this paragraph was for the subtitle, and we're just going to append the group members to this subtitle unordered list. So create an ordered list. Then we're going to come into our graph query here and we're going to iterate through the results, and we're just going to create a list item for every user that came out of that query. And thanks to the output we have here in our console, we can see the structure of that data. So in our request, we're going to be looking for an array under the value that has the name under the display name field. After we have the data, I can actually loop now through the response.value. And then what I want to do is I'm going to make a string to hold our list items. So we'll let members string equal. And now we just have to loop through all those. So we can do, that was going to be a list item. It's going to be response.value subindex, and that field was display name. And we'll close off our list item. Okay, so we're looping through all those results, and we're just creating a list item for every name that we find in those results. And then we just need to go through and we need to do a document get element by class name, and that was subtitle, I believe. So that was styles.subtitle. And we use the first one it finds. And we want to set its inner HTML to the members. Okay? So now this web part should spit out that information. So let's go ahead and save that. Gulp is doing its thing. And now we should be able to refresh our page here. And it's telling us the names of the people within this group. Okay? So it's actually doing something with the data from the graph. But now what we want to do is let's take the same application and let's turn it into a Teams application. So we could add this application as a tab to any team, and it would list all the members of that team. Okay? And that is where version 1.7 of the SharePoint framework comes into play. Up until this point, you haven't needed version 1.7, but now that we're doing something for Teams, we do need that. So let's go through the process of making this a Teams application. The first thing we need to do in order to use Teams is we need to get the Teams context. So we're going to come into our web part class, and we're going to create a variable that's going to be storing the Teams context. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the value of that variable. So by getting the Teams context. And this chunk of code came from the tutorial for using the SharePoint Framework version 1.7. Again, I'll have links to all the resources that I used to create this. But essentially all this is doing is it's getting the Teams context and setting it to that variable for us. So now we have the ability to check to see if that Teams context variable is set. And if it's set, that means that our application is running from within Teams, and we can use the Teams information that we want to. So this gives us the ability to create applications for either SharePoint or Teams, and the same application can work in both places. So our application before was looking at the group ID for the SharePoint site. So now we can change our code to say, well, if this is a Teams application, don't look at the group ID for the site. Give me the ID for the actual team that we're in, and we can use that to get the group members. So let's go ahead and make this application work in both Teams and SharePoint. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to create another variable here called title. And it is going to, by default, say welcome to SharePoint. And we will come in here and we will tell it to use that variable instead of the hard-coded text. Okay, so now let's check to see if we're running in Teams. And the way we do that is to see if our variable has been set, if our variable exists. So I can say if this Teams context, if this variable exists, that means that we are within Teams, and I know that I need to change my title to, instead of saying welcome to SharePoint, it needs to say welcome to teams. And instead of using the group ID that we got from the page context, we need to set our group ID to be equal to this teams context dot group ID. Okay, and that's all we've done. So we created a variable to store the teams context. We got the teams context. Then we're checking to see if we're in the teams context, and if we are, we're going to be using the ID for teams and not the ID for the group for the site. And then the rest of the code is just going to execute the same. So we can save this. And let's go ahead and see if our solution still works within SharePoint, which it should. So let's refresh the page here. And it says, welcome to SharePoint, the GUID for the group and the group members. So that still seems to be working. So now let's rebuild our solution, deploy it, and then we will add it to Teams as an application in Teams. So I'm going to again do a gulp bundle, package solution. Now we need to go back into our app catalog here. Let's upload our solution again. And deploy it. So we've deployed our solution to SharePoint again, and now let's deploy our solution to Teams. To do that, we need to open up our project files, and that was in our Dummies guide, and then we had that Teams folder. So what we need to do is we need to take these 3 files within the Teams folder, which are the icon files, and you can change them to different icons that you want to use for your application, and then the manifest, and this manifest file is key to getting this application to work as a Teams application. So what we need to do is we need to take these files and we need to add them to a zip, and we need to give it a name. I'll call this Hello Dummy. And now I need to go into Teams. So from within Teams, we need to choose which team do we want to add the application to. So let's add it to the manufacturing group or team here. So let's open up the team, and we're going to go to manage the team. Then we're going to click on the apps, and from here you will have an option on the bottom right to upload a custom app. If you don't see this option to upload a custom app, it means that you don't have side loading enabled on for teams within your tenant. So you'll need to go into the admin center, you'll need to enable side loading, and then you'll be able to upload a custom application. So we're going to click on upload custom application. We are going to go to that Teams folder, and we're going to upload that zip file Hello Dummy. It's showing us that Hello Dummy has been added. I can now go into one of the channels. I can add a tab here, and it's going to list our application Hello Dummy right here as a tab, or as an app for a tab. Just save that. Here's our tab Hello Dummy, and you can see welcome to Teams. Besides the fact that I can't spell the word welcome, you can see that we are executing within Teams. Here's the GUID for this group, and then the members of this group. So I can come to a different team. Let's go to this other team over here, and let's do it again to make sure that we get a different GUID, so you'll know that I'm not making things up. So let's come over into the IT group, go to manage team, go to our apps, let's upload a custom app, upload Hello Dummy, go into our channels, add an app, and we'll save that. So I will point out that when I went through this entire process, the first time I created the solution, it would not allow me to add the app to the desktop client. I had to use the web client. I'm assuming this is going to just require an update to my desktop client that hasn't been rolled out yet. So if you are having issues getting your app to add to your desktop client, try adding it to the web client. But we can see here in this IT group, there's a lot more people involved. So it's saying, hey, welcome to Teams, and it's listing all those people. So from here, you can see that you can just get started using the graph. We can do things now because of the graph to, like, let's say, send all these people a message, or let's create a meeting for these people. Or as we're going to do in the next video on this, is I'm going to now take this information for all these group members, and I'm going to go use the Find Time API in the Microsoft Graph to say, hey, find me a meeting time where all these people on this group have availability, and let's schedule a meeting for those people. So that's going to be a little more involved, but it's going to be like the part 2 of getting this to work. But to recap everything that we did, so we showed you how to use the graph, how to add that client to your project, how to request permissions to the graph and grant those permissions to the graph, how to deploy it, how to start using the Teams app, and how to deploy your application to Teams and get it working. I hope that this wasn't too rambling. You learned something. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll try to address them. But go out there and make some awesome stuff. This stuff is really easy to do and it just works. Thanks.